After the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, many people thought that Marxism had been defeated politically as well as intellectually. But few people realized that as traditional communism became increasingly discredited, Marxism in fact metastasized from an economic doctrine into a cultural one. Indeed, this transformation of Marxism had already happened several decades before the fall of the Berlin Wall. As Western countries have remained capitalist in name, most people do not associate our present times and politics with communist ideas. However, Marxist thought is alive and kicking throughout Europe and the US, dominating our political and cultural life, and even the minds of most people, though few may actually realize that. The original Marxist idea is that after feudalism was overthrown by the French Revolution and Western societies entered the era of industrialization and capitalist competition, general impoverishment would follow suit, inspiring workers of all nations to come together and bring about a world revolution characterized by complete material, personal and spiritual equality. Karl Marx's philosophy thus centered around the promise of a new and higher stage in history, a world in which the differences between the rich and the poor would vanish, in which cultures, nations and religions would no longer divide the grand family of mankind, a world of truly universal human beings, living in peace, harmony and equality. Lenin famously believed that this stage of history could only be reached through political revolution, inspiring Bolsheviks and many others to overthrow capitalist regimes and implement communist dictatorships. From 1917 onwards, communist revolutions or attempts at such revolutions were legion. They occurred in Italy, Spain, Finland, Iran, even in the Netherlands. And of course, Leninism took root above all in Russia. This revolutionary spirit was contradicted, most notably, by an Italian thinker of the early 1920s, Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci was a radical communist as well, but he believed that communist revolutions could never be successful if people still identified with the institutions of bourgeois society, family, nation, religion, and so on. He claimed that Marx's end state of radical equality could materialize only if people were first emancipated from all such communal loyalties. He argued that people could not be world citizens if they also felt French or Italian, that they would not be able to transcend social class if they were also proud members of a particular family, and that they would not truly believe in a terrestrial utopia if God still loomed large in their hearts. In its tendency to exaggerate or even caricaturize these bourgeois values that the Marxists try to undermine, values such as the nation, family and religion, Gramsci saw fascism, which developed in roughly the same period, the 1920s and 1930s, as in fact a kind of defense mechanism of traditional society against communist attempts at revolution. This defense mechanism had to be dismantled first, he argued, before it would make sense to push for a communist order. Now, how could that be done? As fascism had shown, according to Gramsci, the attempt to impose radical equality through political revolution would only trigger a strengthening of nationhood, family and religious instinct as a form of defense mechanism. and as seems to have been vindicated by the re-emergence of national pride and religious life in former communist countries like Hungary, Poland and Russia, Gramsci was right in seeing it as such, and such attempts at political revolution could indeed be counterproductive to the communist cause. The true communists then, according to Gramsci, had to find a way to neutralize these defense mechanisms first. Only a long, surreptitious march through the cultural institutions of society and the subsequent weaponization of these institutions against bourgeois values could achieve this goal. It was only then, after decades of cultural deconstruction, that political revolution would finally start to make sense, according to Gramsci, and the Marxist end stage would eventually come within reach. Precisely these Gramscian ideas formed the basis of the immensely influential Institut für Sozialforschung, founded in Frankfurt in 1928, but relocated to the United States in the 1930s. Its members developed a form of cultural criticism, named critical theory, that was designed to undermine bourgeois values. The trick was to identify in every sphere of life the inherent power relations that exist within them and inevitably constitute some form of oppression, however small or trivial. The point was to discredit the institution or the hierarchy responsible for it. Schools, teachers, national politics, national history, sexual relations, the clergy, authorities in general, conventional clothing, and so on. The constant suggestion being that we would be better off without them. And this simple intellectual routine is what came to be called cultural Marxism, the structural undermining of bourgeois society by discrediting it with endless accounts of its supposed oppressiveness, and by presenting at the same time egalitarian or anarchist alternatives to its allegedly hierarchical structures. Sexual liberation, pantheist spirituality, atonal music, modern architecture, mass immigration, hagiographic non-Western anthropology, and so on. So Gramsci believed that social structures had to be dissolved for the Marxist revolution to succeed. But apart from calling for this deconstruction of bourgeois society, the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School also accepted Gramsci's analysis that fascism was essentially society's defense mechanism against Marxist or communist revolution. Therefore, anyone resisting critical theory was, to some extent, in their view, a fascist. This is what we now basically call political correctness, and it is essentially a slippery slope argument. If you defend national identity, you are denounced a nationalist, which then is not so far away from National Socialism and so on. If you defend the traditional family, you are essentially seen as a sexist, which then is only 1 or 2 steps away from Mussolini and so on. Anyone defending bourgeois values in public discourse must be familiar with this intellectual reflex, from defending bourgeois values to being denounced as a fascist. And it has been described with some irony as Godwin's law, of course, the watertight prediction that within 3 steps conservative positions are always being linked to fascism. But the thinkers of the Frankfurt School actually believed this to be true. They genuinely thought that resisting the deconstruction of bourgeois values was only a few steps away from fascism, and that such bourgeois values were, in fact, inherently unjust, oppressive, and backwards. Hewing then with this double-edged sword, critical theory on the one hand and political correctness on the other, the teachings of the Frankfurt School became increasingly influential. By means of their long march through the institutions, cultural Marxists have come to dominate both the cultural and the political agenda of the West today. Its protagonists shaped the entire generation of the 60s, which has in turn reshaped the very structure of our societies. Bourgeois values have consistently been undermined in nearly every field of life. We've seen a push across the board for mass immigration, multiculturalism, the discrediting of Christianity, the siphoning away of sovereignty, the ridiculization of our historical heroes, the weakening of family structures, and so on. We've witnessed the rise of revisionist history courses that teach children how our past is supposedly abundant with violence and hatred, while completely ignoring our moments of greatness. We've seen the movement for so-called sexual liberation that reduces sex to a contractual handshake or a commodity, rather than the starting point of a sacred bond. The attempt to push emancipation and feminism to a point where families become dysfunctional and succumb under the pressure of complete interchangeability, double careers, and struggle for supremacy. The deliberate disfiguration of our cities and villages by modern architecture, together with the daunting image of modern art and music and the ridicule for churches and piety, it all provides us with a thorough sense of alienation. And all of these points might seem isolated areas of policy, but in fact they're not. They're all part of a single ideological agenda. And as different as they may seem, they also have the same effect. They undermine bourgeois life, instincts, belief, traditions, and identities, and thus, in the mind of the Marxist, they all help to prepare our hearts and minds for utopia. Marxism then has not suffered from the fall of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of communist regimes. It's more omnipresent than ever before. It's furthered by our intellectuals, by mainstream politicians, by the European Union, by our cultural icons. It's financed by super-rich philanthropists. It's taught in schools and in Hollywood movies. Its mindset is propagated through popular culture and Netflix productions, through mass immigration and global governance schemes. Marxism, in short, is everywhere. We are living in the Marxist age, and we must fight it, because the ideal of a post-bourgeois society is deeply unattractive. In 1973, the great Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn published his immensely influential book, The Gulag Archipelago, exposing the realities of political Marxism. It took brave authors like him to speak out and make people realize that communist countries were not utopia, but living hell. In my view, the French author Michel Houellebecq is doing the same thing with cultural Marxism today. He shows in each of his books what life without bourgeois culture looks like, and indeed what European civilization is heading for if things will continue along their current path. Alienated, atomized, and lonely, we will dwell in isolation. Immigration will destroy national cohesion. Unlimited global markets will destroy local production. Sexual consumerism will destroy families. And without religious bonds, consolatory architecture, and serious art, a total meaninglessness awaits us that will push us to the point of suicide, both at the individual level and at the level of our civilization as a whole. Marx's prophecy of a world revolution and radical economic equality turned out to be unsustainable. Likewise, the idea of a new society without patriarchal structures, a world without nations and families and churches, is both impossible and highly undesirable. Increasingly, our societies are becoming unhappier, uglier, more crime-ridden, lonelier, poorer, grayer, and sadder. We have come to the point where we need to realize that the Marxist worldview itself is flawed. We're not going to experience the end of history. No one is. We're not going to see mankind growing together as one, and there is no final stage in history. Marxism is a fantasy. It's an unrealistic fantasy. It did not work in the economic sense, and fortunately it was beaten. But it doesn't work in the cultural sense either, and it's time we defeat it there